All right, diving in today, folks, we're tackling a pretty fascinating figure, Blaise Pascal.
Definitely fascinating.
Yeah, born in 1623, died in 1662, and the thing is, he never actually published any, like, straight-up philosophy books while he was alive.
Yeah.
But even so, he left a pretty significant philosophical legacy, right?
Right.
So we're going on a mission to sort of unpack, I guess, or uncover the philosophy that's kind of embedded in his work in science, his theological writing.
His pensée.
And the Pensées, that's like his posthumously published collection of thoughts.
Exactly. And for someone, interested in philosophy, Pascal's a really interesting case.
Right.
Because we have to, like, get his philosophy from all these different areas of his life. Right?
Yeah. It's like a philosophical detective story almost.
Exactly.
So the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy, that's our main source for this deep dive.
Right.
And we're going to kind of extract, hopefully, the core philosophical ideas.
Right.
And keep in mind, of course, the background and the context, right, of his time.
Exactly.
Where do we even begin?
I think a good place to start is with the man himself.
Okay.
Pascal's life isn't just kind of a backdrop to his ideas.
Right.
It actually, like, really shaped them.
So born in Clermont, France.
Right.
And his mother died when he was quite young.
Very young, yeah.
Yeah. So he was raised by his father alongside his two sisters.
Right.
His father was a mathematician, Etienne.
Etienne, right.
Yeah. And what's kind of interesting is Blaise Pascal was educated mainly at home.
Yeah, very interesting.
Focused on classical languages and mathematics. That's a pretty unique approach.
Definitely unique for the time. Yeah, and I think, for a philosopher, it's really interesting that Pascal had this early training in mathematics. It gave him a certain way of thinking that I think we see even in his later work.
Yeah.
Even when he's doing different things.
Yeah.
And actually, his father, being a mathematician himself, he connected Pascal to the Mersenne circle in Paris.
Oh, wow.
So he was meeting the leading intellectuals of the day when he was, a young man.
Right from the start, almost.
Right from the start.
Yeah.
And Pascal, when he was 16, he wrote this work, Essai pour le conique.
Yeah.
He was on conic sections.
Yeah.
And it really showed that he was, kind of a prodigy. He was very precocious, smart from a young age.
Yeah. And then also shaping his thought, he suffered from a really intense health problem.
Oh, yeah, for his whole life.
Yeah.
Starting very young. I mean, his sister said he was in pain constantly from the age of 18.
Oh, wow.
And by the time he was 24, he could only have, like, liquids.
Yeah.
He was basically on a liquid diet.
Oh, wow. So it's pretty hard to imagine how that wouldn't affect your outlook.
Right.
Yeah.
Your worldview. Yeah. For a philosopher, I mean, you have to think how this, always being aware of your body, always being aware of these limitations, how that would shape his understanding of things like suffering, our search for meaning.
Yeah.
Yeah. And the encyclopedia points out, his emphasis on human wretchedness.
Yeah.
This could come from that, this very physical place.
Yeah. And on top of the health problems, the family had to move around a lot.
Yeah.
For political and financial reasons.
The Paris, Clermont-Ferrand.
Okay.
They ended up in Rouen.
Yeah.
And this is all going on when France is at war with Spain, and there's all this religious conflict.
Right.
So, again, it's, not a very stable environment.
Not a stable life at all.
No.
But even with all that, he managed to, like, make groundbreaking strides in science.
Oh, yeah.
He invented the first calculating machine.
Yeah, in Rouen.
Yeah. And then, of course, his work with barometers, right?
Yeah, inspired by Torricelli.
Torricelli, yeah.
And the famous Puy de Dôme experiment.
The Puy de Dôme, which was actually carried out by his brother-in-law.
Yeah, Perrier.
Yeah.
And that experiment it's a really important moment in the scientific revolution.
Yeah.
And I think what's interesting for a philosopher is that, Pascal, when he was thinking about that experiment, he actually misinterpreted it.
Oh, really?
Yeah, like the encyclopedia says, his first take on what that experiment meant about the vacuum, it was wrong. So, science is hard, right?
Yeah.
You don't always get it right the first time. And it makes you think maybe this early mistake made Pascal a little bit cautious about empirical knowledge.
Yeah. So then this is where things get pretty interesting, I think, around when he was 23.
Right.
He's introduced to Jansenism.
Right, by these two brothers, the Deschamps brothers. They were taking care of Pascal's father after he had an accident.
Mm-hmm.
And these brothers, they were Jansenists. And Jansenism, they put a lot of emphasis on how humans are corrupted.
Okay.
And they even thought that wanting to know things, wanting knowledge, that could be a sin.
Mm.
Like, you should just be focused on God.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
That must have presented kind of a dilemma for him.
Right. I mean, Jansen saying that the desire for knowledge is bad, and Pascal, he's a scientist.
Right.
It's this tension. I'm not sure that he, gave up on science right away.
Right.
But
yeah.
I think it definitely made him start to wonder, about what's really important.
Yeah. Yeah. And then he has these big personal changes too, right?
Oh, yeah.
His sister's leaving home.
Yeah.
Jacqueline, in particular, decides to enter the Port Royal Convent.
Yeah.
Which is a Jansenist convent.
It is.
Yeah. And this is after their father had passed away.
Yeah.
And, I mean, Pascal, wasn't initially thrilled about this.
Yeah.
He didn't really want her to go.
But she went anyway.
Yeah. And that left him, completely on his own for the first time in his life.
For the first time.
Yeah. And that seems to be when his religious focus really, deepens.
Yeah, yeah.
With guidance from, his sister Jacqueline at the convent.
Right.
And Antoine Singlin.
Right.
Yeah. So, I mean, all these personal things going on.
I mean, his whole family, it's kind of breaking up.
Yeah.
And he's dealing with his health.
Yeah.
So it makes sense that he's looking for something more, something outside of himself.
Yeah, yeah.
And it makes you think, right, about how these big changes in your life can affect what you believe.
Yeah, yeah.
know.
He does return to mathematics for a bit,
He does.
corresponding with Fermat
Right.
about probability.
Yeah, that leads to his work, Traité du triangle arithmétique,
Yeah.
on the arithmetic triangle.
But then, in 1654, we have this huge turning point.
Yeah.
His religious conversion experience.
Right, and he writes it all down.
Yeah, in the memorial.
The memorial,
Yeah.
yeah. This, intense dreamlike experience.
Yeah, yeah. And this wasn't just him, deciding, oh, yeah, I believe this.
No,
This
yeah.
was like a complete transformation.
It changed everything.
Yeah.
He stops doing math.
Yeah.
He doesn't publish his work on the vacuum.
Well, at least not right away.
Right. It came out later after he died.
Yeah.
But his focus, I mean, from this point on, it's religion.
Yeah.
It's theology.
Yeah.
It's what he's spending his time on.
Right. Right. And this brings up a really interesting point for philosophers, right?
Right.
What is this kind of religious experience?
Yeah.
How can it be so powerful that it changes your whole perspective?
Exactly.
Changes your whole life.
Well,
His final years were marked by, religious controversy. His health was always a problem, and just kind of a feeling of loneliness.
yeah.
And he becomes a huge defender of Jansenism.
A huge defender.
Yeah. Especially in the provincial letters.
Right. Those letters, they're attacks on the Jesuits.
Yeah. Yeah. Very satirical.
Satirical. Yeah. Very sharp. It shows how smart he was, but also how committed he was to his beliefs.
Yeah.
And I think, for someone studying philosophy, those letters, they give us like a glimpse into his ethics.
Yeah.
How he thought about morality. Like, for example, he really goes after the Jesuits for what he sees as their lax morality.
Right.
Like they were too lenient, too permissive.
Yeah.
He thought that there were some things, like killing someone unjustly, that's just wrong,
Yeah.
no matter what.
Yeah. And then we have, of course, the Pensée,
The Pensée.
the kind of fragmentary notes.
Yeah, notes he was making for a book he was going to write.
Right. Defending Christianity.
Right. But it never got finished.
Right. Published after he died.
And you have to be careful, right?
Yeah.
We don't know, like the encyclopedia says, we don't know for sure if he agreed with everything he wrote down.
Right.
And we don't know what order he wanted those notes to be in.
Right. Right. And of course the Pensée, that's where we find the famous wager.
The wager, yeah. Which is, still a topic of debate in philosophy.
Yeah.
Especially in the philosophy of religion and decision theory.
Yeah. And it's also, the Pensées also give us, I think, just a really personal look into his struggles.
Right, definitely.
His doubts, how he's trying to, wrap his head around these huge questions of faith and existence.
Yeah, and you see how skeptical he is, how much he's influenced by Montaigne,
Yeah.
and how all of this comes together with his, deep faith, his commitment to Jansenism.
Right, right.
So it's a complex picture.
Yeah, Yeah. Okay, so we've got his life, the influences.
Right.
Let's dig into some of the philosophical themes that we see emerging from his work. I mean, right off the bat, we have this idea of the relationship between nature and grace,
Yeah.
which is huge for Pascal.
Huge, yeah. He was really influenced by Augustine.
Right.
And he had this very, very strong view about human nature.
Okay.
Human nature's fallen.
Right.
It's corrupted. It's all because of Adam's sin.
Okay.
And, he thought this corruption was so bad that, there's no way that humans can save themselves or even really understand God on their own.
Okay.
We need help.
And that's where grace comes in.
Right. Grace, it's a gift.
Right.
From God.
Yeah.
And it's not something you earn. It's not about, being good enough or being smart enough.
It's not something that you can figure out, like, with your reason.
No, you can't earn it.
Yeah.
And you can't understand it fully.
Yeah. Which is really different from, like, Locke or Tolan.
Right.
Who thought faith should be, like, rational.
Yeah, understandable.
Yeah. But Pascal's like, no, it goes beyond that.
It goes beyond that. It's mysterious. It's supernatural. Yeah. And you have to just accept it.
Right.
Yeah.
And here's the thing. He's also very clear that Roman Catholicism, that's the only way.
Okay.
So on the one hand, he's saying, look, human reason is limited.
Yeah.
You can't fully grasp God.
Right.
But then on the other hand, he's like, but I'm absolutely certain that the Catholic Church is right.
Yeah.
So, as a philosopher, you have to think about that. How does that work?
Yeah.
How can you be so sure about one specific religion when you're also saying that we can't, fully understand these things with our minds?
Yeah.
And this leads him to reject the traditional proofs for God's existence.
Right. The rational argument.
Yeah, the cosmological argument, the ontological argument.
Ontological, yeah.
It's like, those aren't very convincing.
They don't really matter.
Yeah. For him, faith is the only way. It's a gift.
A gift.
Yeah.
So let's talk about the wager.
Okay.
Because, it's so often misunderstood.
Yeah. People think it's like this proof to get people to believe.
Right.
But it's not that.
It's not that at all. It's like if you're already open to the idea of God.
Yeah. If you're, on the fence, maybe.
Yeah, then it makes sense to believe.
Because, the potential reward is infinite.
Right.
And even if you're wrong, you haven't lost that much.
Yeah.
So it's more about, like, what's the smart bet to make.
Right.
Not about, forcing anyone to believe.
Okay, so moving on to free will, which is, another one of those kind of big, thorny philosophical issues.
Yeah.
And again, we see Augustine's influence here.
Oh, yeah, huge influence. And it's important to remember, I think, Pascal's not really talking about, like, the little choices we make every day.
Right.
Should I have a coffee or tea?
Yeah.
He's more interested in the big choices.
The moral choices.
Yeah.
The ones about salvation.
Right. And he's, in line with the Jansenist perspective here, he thinks concupiscence.
Concupiscence.
Yeah, which is basically our bad desires. That's what drives most of our, what we call choices.
Yeah. We're kind of slaves to our desires.
Yeah. And it's only through God's intervention, through what they call efficacious grace, that we can even make good choices.
Right.
And this is where the problem comes in, right?
Right. The big philosophical question.
Yeah.
If God's grace is actually controlling us,
Yeah.
making us choose the good, then how can we be free?
Right.
But then, if grace is just kind of like a suggestion,
Right.
hey, you should do this, but it doesn't actually make us do it, then, well, how does that solve the problem of concupiscence?
Right.
How does that help us overcome our fallen nature?
Yeah. Pascal's solution to this is complicated.
Okay.
It seems kind of paradoxical, but he says that we have free will, but it's also infallibly moved by God's grace.
Right. So it's like we're free to choose, but somehow God makes sure we choose the right thing.
Right, without it feeling like we're being forced.
Yeah, without coercion.
Yeah. And we always have the ability to sin.
Right. We can resist grace.
Yeah. But God can dispose the free will.
Dispose the free will.
Yeah.
It's tricky.
And then you have to, consider predestination.
Yeah, that's the big implication here.
If God's grace is what saves us and not everyone gets it,
right,
then it seems like God's already decided who's going to be saved and who's not.
So that raises questions about, is that fair?
Yeah.
What about our responsibility?
Yeah.
It gets into these really deep questions about, divine justice and what it means to be human.
Yeah. Yeah.
Tough stuff.
So let's move on to his theory of knowledge,
Okay.
which, as the encyclopedia points out, he didn't actually write, like, a complete book about.
No, not a systematic work on epistemology.
Yeah. Right, right. But we do see like a lot of different ideas, kind of bouncing around in his writings.
Yeah.
And it's kind of interesting because, he was trained in science, but then he becomes so focused on, his faith.
Right.
And we see these different ways of knowing, right?
Yeah, so he talks about our senses,
Right.
our reason,
Yeah.
and faith.
And of course for him, faith is specifically Catholic faith.
Yeah. That's the key for him.
Right.
So, the senses, that's how we get facts about the world.
Right.
Reason, that's how we understand those facts.
Yeah.
And faith, well, that's how we understand things that go beyond the natural world.
The supernatural.
The supernatural, the revealed truths.
Right.
But then you have to ask, well, what happens when these different ways of knowing, clash?
Yeah, yeah.
Which one wins out?
Which one's more important?
Yeah, that's a big question for a philosopher to think about.
And he's definitely not afraid of skepticism either.
Right. He liked Montaigne.
Yeah.
He was interested in, those skeptical arguments about whether we can really know anything for sure.
Especially when it came to science.
Especially science.
Mm-hmm.
But even though he had these doubts, he also, had a lot of confidence in our ability to know things.
Okay.
Matters of fact, he called them.
Right.
And he said, look, we can know those things for sure. Through experience, through our senses.
Like in the Provincial Letters when he's defending Arnauld.
Right.
And he's like, look, these propositions that they're saying are heretical. They're not even in Augustine's work.
Right.
Just read the book.
Yeah, and he even brings up Galileo.
He does.
Yeah.
Yeah.
They can say whatever they want, but they can't stop the earth from moving.
Right.
If that's what the evidence shows.
Right, right. So he's basically saying even the Pope can't tell us what to believe when it comes to facts.
Exactly.
But when it came to explaining, how things worked, like the mechanisms of nature,
right.
That's where hypotheses come in.
Hypotheses, yeah.
Yeah.
But he's very careful about how much certainty we can have in them.
Right.
Even when they're confirmed by experiment.
Right. And his analysis of the Puy de Dôme experiment, it's fascinating because it kind of hints at this idea that comes up much later, the Duhem-Quine thesis.
Right.
Which is, like, you can never test a hypothesis in isolation.
You're always testing a whole bunch of assumptions at the same time.
Yeah, so it gets complicated.
It does.
And his background in math, it really comes through in how he thinks about hypotheses.
Yeah. He classifies them based on, whether saying yes or no to them leads to a contradiction.
Right.
And he points out, sometimes you can get to a true conclusion even if your starting point was wrong. Which, something that a lot of people don't think about.
Yeah, yeah. And you see that mathematical perspective in his book, De l'Esprit Géométrique.
Right.
Where he's basically saying that real certainty, like rock-solid certainty, that comes from self-evident principles.
Yeah. So in mathematics, you have your axioms,
Right.
starting points.
Right.
And from there, you can build up knowledge.
Yeah.
But the question is, can you do that in science?
Right. Yeah.
Can you find those same kind of foundational principles in the natural world?
Yeah.
It's not so clear.
So he's kind of skeptical about scientific knowledge, but he's also optimistic about scientific progress.
Yeah.
Right?
He thinks that, as we do more experiments,
Yeah.
as we gather more data, we're going to learn more about the world.
Right.
And he's excited about new instruments like telescopes.
Which is interesting because when it comes to religious belief, he relies on authority.
Yeah, right.
Right.
It's like, okay, so in science, we need experiments, we need to test things.
Yeah.
But in religion, it's about what the authorities tell us.
Like who are the right authorities?
Yeah, what are the right texts?
Right.
And he doesn't really get into the weeds on that. He just kind of assumes, it's clear who the authorities are.
Right. It's clear what the right books are.
And then, of course, he uses his own conversion experience.
Yeah, that personal experience.
That's as proof.
Right. And, again, as a philosopher, you have to think about that.
Yeah.
Is that a good basis for belief?
Yeah.
What about other people's experiences?
So let's talk about his ethics and his politics.
Okay.
We can't ignore his critique of the Jesuits.
Yeah, the Provincial Letters.
Blue Letter.
He really went after them. And it's interesting because, on the one hand, he's criticizing what he calls their lax morality. Like they were too willing to bend the rules.
Yeah.
But on the other hand, he's appealing to natural law.
Right, which is usually thought of as, something that's based on reason.
Exactly.
Right.
But for Pascal, natural law isn't about, what humans figure out on their own.
Right.
It's about God's law.
It's the remnants of God's law that are still, kind of imprinted on us, even though we're fallen.
Right.
So it's a very different view of natural law.
So there's no such thing as like a purely philosophical system of ethics for him.
No.
It all has to come back to God.
It all comes back to God. And he does believe in objective morality.
Okay.
Like he gives examples.
What is, like, you can't kill someone unjustly.
You can't kill someone unjustly.
Yeah.
And if you're rich, you have to give to the poor from your surplus.
And his critique of this Jesuit idea of directing the intention is pretty important.
Yeah.
Philosophically
important.
Yeah.
Because, the Jesuits were saying, well, look, if you're doing something that's maybe not great,
yeah,
but your intention is good, then it's okay.
Right.
But Pascal's like, no.
That doesn't fly.
That doesn't fly. You can't just, make a bad action good by thinking good thoughts.
Right.
The action itself still matters.
Right.
And that's kind of an early version of an objection to what we call the principle of double effect.
Right.
Which is still debated in ethics today.
Yeah. And he also really disliked this idea of probabilism.